We're going to begin with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have had and continue to have presence and deep connection with the lands on and near the Oak Ridges Moraine, part of what is known to Indigenous peoples of North America as Turtle Island. These lands are the meeting place of two treaties, the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and those of the Chippewas of Georgina Island, Rama, and Beausoleil, and the Mississaugas of Alderville, Curve Lake, Hiawatha, and Scugog Island. These are the nations of the Williams Treaty. We would like to thank them and other Indigenous peoples for sharing this land with us. We acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have been subjected to colonial oppression and injustice, which continues to this day. We acknowledge that the first step to reconciliation is recognizing Indigenous peoples and their inherent right to the land. We will continue to create a better future for our relationship with Indigenous peoples and the land. The Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust endeavors to honor the land and its treaties by ensuring healthy ecosystems that thrive forever. And we recognize that working together with Indigenous peoples moves us towards an equitable and sustainable future by including ecological traditional knowledge systems. So what is a land trust and what do we do? Well, about 90% of the land on the moraine is privately owned, and this makes it vulnerable to development, although there are laws in place to help protect it. So we work with landowners to help protect important habitats on the moraine, particularly to help safeguard the biodiversity and species at risk that call this part of the province home. And the level of protection that we offer goes beyond legislation. So environmental regulations, as we've seen, can change and be strengthened and weakened depending on who's in power, provincially or federally. But the level of protection that we offer sort of safeguards against any of these kinds of changes. So land trusts are a type of nonprofit. We're a registered charity, and we can either acquire land outright by purchasing or having nature reserves donated to us, or we can do things like have easements on people's properties. So somebody might still live on their property, they might even farm part of it, and different parts of that property will be zoned differently. Part of it will be set aside to be protected as habitat, and that can't be changed or developed. They won't be able to come through and cut down the trees. And one thing that's really important about the level of protection that land trusts provide is that we're mandated legally to protect these places in perpetuity. So we can't change our mind in 10 or 15 years and decide to sell it to somebody or put up a condo if we change our minds. We have to protect these places forever. And so that's one of the most valuable things that land trusts can offer. How do we protect the moraine? Well, we contribute to the federal government's goal of protecting 30% of land by 2030. We do educational programming. We do a lot of in-person events as well as virtual events like this webinar this evening that help connect people with nature. I did a visit to an elementary school earlier this week where I talked to the kids in a grade 5 class about the moraine. We had another webinar on Tuesday with a guest speaker about groundwater, and we have some upcoming in-person walks as well. So there's all sorts of programming that we do. Our protected properties help support climate change resiliency. We protect green corridors between natural areas. Those are really important for the movement of wildlife. And like we mentioned, we help support and protect ecologically significant lands on and near the moraine in perpetuity. One of the mechanisms that we use to be able to do this is called the Ecological Gifts Program. This is through the federal government, through the Canada Revenue Agency, and it offers really incredible tax breaks for people who want to donate their land outright or put a conservation easement on their land if it has ecological value. So that's one of the most effective ways that we're able to protect land, especially with the exorbitant price of real estate around the GTA. And legacy giving is another part of the work that we do. So a lot of the donations we receive and some of the properties that we've had donated to us come through that. We're working on a really cool project right now in Northumberland County, and will be for the next, probably over a decade. So we're trying to restore 2 sites now. It started off as 1 site into this really unique oak pine habitat that will help support this bird called the Kirtland's warbler. This is an endangered bird that only breeds around the Great Lakes. Most of them breed in Michigan in the jack pine forests. And they really depend on forest fires to help open up the cones of jack pines and to a lesser extent red pines so that their seeds can germinate. And because of habitat loss, conversion of these jack pine forests and these habitats to agricultural land and to subdivisions, as well as the suppression of natural cycles of forest fire and indigenous land management practices, which included controlled burns, this habitat really disappeared. And by the early 70s, there was only about 400 of these birds left on Earth. Now, today, they were just taken off the endangered species list in the US. They've had a really incredible recovery there, but they're still endangered in Ontario. There's very few of them in the province. So we're hoping to bring back this habitat and help a lot of other species as well that depend on the same types of places. Things like the eastern hognose snake, the red-headed woodpecker, the common nighthawk, and pollinators like the monarch butterfly and the American bumblebee. So as I mentioned before, we have some really excellent events coming up over the next little while. I'm excited for Saturday, March 1st. We're going to have a guided walk at one of our nature reserves in Schomberg, Ontario. That's sort of a winter wildlife wander. So we'll be looking for signs of wildlife, things like tracks and signs, as well as winter plant life and how to recognize, wildflowers and trees and things like that in the wintertime. We have a really great webinar coming up on March 12th, which is all around the reintroduction of this endangered butterfly called the mottled dusky wing. That's really exciting. There's some really interesting work that's being done there at a few sites across Ontario. We have an in-person event coming up on Tuesday, April 8th, if we can, look forward to the spring and all that that brings. We're at another nature reserve we have in Schomberg, Ontario, where we'll be listening for the sound of different frogs, things like spring peepers, wood frogs, western chorus frogs that live in a kettle lake out there. And then on April 26th, we're going to have a guided walk at that same nature reserve in Schomberg that's dedicated to spring wildflowers. Those spring ephemerals, things like bloodroot, trout lily, hepatica, spring beauty, those species that bloom very briefly in the early spring when the tree canopy isn't out yet. It only lasts sometimes for a few days. So I'm really excited for that event. So I'm just going to move into my presentation here. So I'm just going to share my screen once more. I'm just going to take a second here to throw a link in the chat for anyone who's interested in learning about some of those upcoming events. I will post a link to our website. Just give me 1 second here. It is February 13th tonight, so we are one night before Valentine's Day. I hope everybody has exciting plans and is looking forward to what they have going on for tomorrow. But this evening, we're going to be talking a little bit about animal courtship. And I'm really excited to share some of these stories with you. There's some really fun different behaviors and things that some of these species get up to. And I've had a great time putting together this presentation. Yeah. All right. So this is the Valentine special animal courtship. So we have this picture on here of a bird we have here throughout the Oak Ridges Moraine. This is a ruffed grouse, and they have a really spectacular courtship display that you can see in the early spring. And we'll talk a little bit more about it later on in the presentation, and I'll show you a video of it. But it produces a really iconic, really spectacular sound, which can really catch you off guard if you're out in the woods in the early part of spring in this part of the world. I have a few videos I'm going to share this evening of different, bird courtship rituals and calls and things like that that they get up to. But I'd like to start by talking a little bit about what courtship is and what the scope of this presentation is going to be. So here we have two cedar waxwings, and they have a unique courtship ritual, which I discovered while I was doing research for this presentation. They like to land on a perch, a tree branch or something like that, and they sort of hop around and approach one another and get a little bit closer. And then sometimes they touch their bills and touch them back and forth. But the really important part of their courtship is passing a small object back and forth. Oftentimes that's a flower petal, a berry, an insect, a little piece of food. Cedar waxwings, when they're not courting, are known for, passing berries to one another. A group of them will land on a berry-producing tree and start passing those berries back and forth and sharing food. So this is a really cute and really unique behavior. But more broadly, courtship is, any series of actions or behaviors that animals use to help attract a mate and throughout that process of mating. So the scale of this presentation will also include a little bit of stuff about animal parenting, reproduction, and things like that as well, just where, some of the stories are interesting. I'll start off with a quick note just by saying that we're a lot of the time throughout this presentation, we're going to be giving examples that are oriented around, male and female members of a species courting one another, mating with one another. But it's really important to acknowledge that there is an incredible diversity of sexual behavior across the animal kingdom. I did a presentation last June that was all about queer ecology and same-sex sexual behavior in animals. Here's a picture of two male mallards courting one another, which is really sweet. But a 2019 study, for instance, found that over 1,500 different animal species engage in same-sex sexual behavior. And that includes over 130 different types of birds and over 260 different types of mammals. And is probably really underreported. There's a huge gap in research and publishing. There was a paper that just came out of U of T back in 2024 in the summer from a researcher named Karen Anderson, who was the lead author on that. And I had the chance to interview her last month. And they interviewed a lot of different mammalogists, zookeepers, people who work with mammals, professionally, asking if any of them had seen their species engage in same-sex sexual behavior. Most of them had, but only a really small minority of them recorded data on it, and an even smaller minority had ever reported on it. So there's definitely huge gaps in our understanding of animal sexuality, particularly around same-sex sexual behavior. And a lot of that has to do with, attitudes that these institutions and scientists have had to come up against over the years. So we'll start off by talking about mammals. There's some really interesting examples of different courtship behaviors in mammals that we can find right here in our backyard, right in the Oak Ridges Moraine region or in southern Ontario. I think one of the most interesting, actually, in the entire presentation is the North American porcupine, because they have an incredibly short window in which the females are in estrus, so able to conceive. It's only about 8 or 12 hours a year, which is incredibly short. And it usually happens around September. So my first question when I read this was, how do the males possibly find a female to mate with if they're only fertile for 8 or 12 hours a year? They have a sensitive sense of smell, so they're able to pick up on scent cues, particularly in the urine of female porcupines and some of the excretions they have. And they have a truly unique courtship ritual in which, in order to indicate his interest in, a potential female mate, male porcupines will urinate on females, and if she decides he's a good match based off of that, they will mate. But it's an incredibly short window in which this can take place. And I'm not sure why they've evolved this, and I'm not sure if scientists are sure either. It seems like a strange adaptation. But yeah, it's an incredibly unique way of courting one another and reproducing. Another good, interesting example are raccoons. Mating often happens in the winter or the early spring, but it varies a lot throughout their range. Raccoons, as we all know, are really well adapted to urban environments, human-modified habitats, places like subdivisions. So sometimes around the availability of food, as well as differences in climate throughout their range, particularly as we have milder winters because of climate change, it sort of pushes around sometimes when they mate. Ahead of mating, in the later in the winter and the early spring, the males become more aggressive and territorial, which probably has to do with changes in hormonal levels like testosterone. And in order to attract a mate, they will screech loudly. And if anyone watching this presentation, particularly people who live in Toronto, have ever heard a raccoon screeching, it is one of the most god-awful sounds you can imagine. I remember when I first moved to the city, hearing that from my apartment window at night, and just thinking, it sounded like a dinosaur or something. It is a spectacularly awful sound, but apparently, if you're a raccoon, that's an effective way to attract a mate. White-tailed deer, I think a lot of people here are familiar with some of the behavior associated around white-tailed deer courtship and some of the seasonal changes that go on with deer in their bodies. So around the early fall, late summer, the antlers of bucks will mineralize, so they become a lot harder, and they start to shed the velvet, which is that thin layer of sort of soft flesh on the outside. And around October or November is usually when it's the rutting season. So that's when deer are starting to reproduce, the white-tailed deer. So throughout the summer and other times in the year, bucks are often fairly tolerant of one another within, the same territory. They don't really mind having like other bucks around, but something interesting starts to happen as we head into the fall. The courtship of white-tailed deer and the changes that happen to their bodies seasonally is heavily associated with the photo period. So that is the amount of light there is in a day. And as we get shorter days, as we head into the fall, it causes their it causes them to produce more melatonin, particularly in their pituitary gland. And with the more melatonin produced, this triggers a bunch of physiological changes, including changes in hormone levels. So some of them start to receive, higher levels of testosterone, which we associate with the males with, more aggression, as well as higher levels of estrogen in other deer. So the bucks start to become more aggressive. They become much less tolerant of other bucks within a particular territory. And that's when you get the classic sort of bucks fighting one another with their antlers, as you can see on that image on the left. And that helps establish dominance and helps establish their territories. There's a really interesting sort of different levels of hierarchy between white-tailed deer bucks. They've been studied extensively over the decades because of their value as a game species. A lot of research and a lot of government funding has gone into studying white-tailed deer and the seasonal changes that take place in their bodies. Something else that's interesting that they do is that they rub their antlers on trees. And this helps to establish their territory, but it also helps attract mates. And they have sweat glands in their foreheads between their antlers, which secrete some of these hormones and help indicate their presence in an area. Whether that's to a different male who might be sort of treading into their territory, testing things out, or whether that's a female that's a potential mate. Something really interesting that a lot of mammals can do is they can actually delay their pregnancy. It's often called delayed implantation. So this is an amazing evolutionary adaptation. As a lot of people on this call are probably aware, pregnancy, raising young, it takes up a lot of energy. And so delayed pregnancy helps ensure that animals can have their young under favorable conditions, and that makes them more likely to survive, and it improves the overall health of the mother. So we can see some pictures here of a few mammals in this region that take part in this, that have evolved this adaptation. So we have a weasel at the top there, a short-tailed weasel. Many members of that family, the mustelids, are capable of delayed implantation, as well as we have a bat there, a big brown bat, and a black bear. So we'll talk a little bit in more detail about some of these examples of delayed implantation. So in species like the American mink and the striped skunk, there's only a very brief window where they can delay this implantation. So it's less than a month. So for instance, minks tend to mate in early March, and then it might be only towards the end of March, where depending upon how favorable conditions are, their access to food, things like that, their body may decide to develop that into a pregnancy. What happens is the egg cell is fertilized by a sperm and it develops into something called a blastocyst, which is like a group of cells. It's sort of like the stage before an embryo develops. And that blastocyst doesn't embed itself in the uterine wall unless conditions are favorable. But other members of that mustelid family, the weasels, things like fishers and river otters, they have a much longer period where that blastocyst can exist in their body before the body decides whether or not it's favorable enough conditions for it to implant. And it can actually be 10 or 11 months, which is pretty remarkable. With black bears, they tend to mate in May or June, and they give birth around January. So that blastocyst is unattached in the uterus for several months, and whether or not it attaches and develops into an embryo, into a fetus, is heavily tied to how much weight they're able to gain in the fall before they rest for the winter. So if by the end of November they've gained enough weight, they've eaten enough calories, their body will allow that blastocyst to implant in the uterine wall. It's not a conscious choice on the animal's part. They're not sitting around deciding whether or not they want to carry this into pregnancy. It all has to do with different hormonal cues going on in their body. In bats as well. Often, species like this little brown bat we have on the left here, they'll mate in the late spring or the fall, or sorry, late summer or the fall. They hibernate all throughout the winter, and then they become pregnant in the spring. So we'll talk a little bit about birds. I have some examples of videos here of some of the bird courtship because I think, just talking about it doesn't really do justice to just how spectacular and interesting some of these bird courtship rituals are. One thing that a lot of birds do, especially songbirds like this eastern bluebird here, is they share food with one another, and that's a way that they're able to court potential mates. I remember a few years ago, I was on a farm in Pontypool, Ontario, sort of out by Peterborough, and I saw a male eastern bluebird, and it was bringing crickets and grasshoppers and things like that to feed a female. And it was incredibly cute to see. So this behavior is seen in warblers, bluebirds, cardinals, crossbills, which are a type of finch, chickadees, as well as species like terns. So it's across different families and different groups of birds. It's a pretty consistent courtship ritual that they practice. So we're going to start off by we're going to show you that aforementioned ruffed grouse drumming. Just give me 1 second here to load the video. So when a male grouse is doing that, um, he's moving his wings in such a way and his tail in such a way that the air is passing through the feathers so quickly that it produces that characteristic drumming sound. And if anyone here has ever been out in the forests of southern Ontario, central Ontario in the early spring, there's a good chance that you've heard that. And it is such a pounding, thumping sound. It feels like you can really feel it in your chest and your heart. It almost feels like, an irregular heartbeat or something. I've heard a lot of people compare it to hearing a motorcycle engine in the woods. It is such a powerful and distinctive sound. And they find a really prominent perch, often a dead log or, a fallen over tree, and they will do that. The male grouse, over and over and over again throughout the day. It's a way of attracting mates. It's also a way of establishing their territory for other grouse. Um, I really recommend, if you ever get the chance to walk around, sort of newer growth forests in this part of the world in the early spring to keep your ears open. And if you hear something thumping like that in your chest that sounds like a motorcycle engine, that is the ruffed grouse. Another really cool example of a courtship ritual that birds in this part of the world engage in is something called a sky dance, and this is something done by bald eagles. So I have another video here to show off this bald eagle courtship. What the bald eagles do in this sky dance is the male and the female will fly up to one another, they'll grab onto each other's claws, and they will fall hundreds of feet through the air, spinning around like that in a sort of an elaborate trust fall. I've never seen this behavior in the wild, but I've seen a fair number of videos of it, and it is spectacular. I can't think of a better way if you're a bird of trying to establish that bond between a potential mate and you to sort of grab onto each other like that and fall so far through the air. So that is an incredibly cool courtship ritual that bald eagles do. And there are species that was heavily affected by DDT in the mid 20th century. It affected the thickness of their eggshells and how likely the embryos were to survive being incubated. But their populations are, recovering really well in eastern North America, and they're starting to nest more and more throughout southern and central Ontario and throughout the Oak Ridges Moraine. We're seeing them nest in places like Hamilton and Toronto, which would have been unthinkable a decade or two ago. So they're a really great example of a conservation success story. Another bird, one that many of us here are probably familiar with, the sandhill crane. They do these really elaborate dances. So I have a video of this as well. So as you can see, the male sandhill crane hops up and down, flapping the wings, sort of approaching the female sandhill crane um, in a behavior that does look a lot like human dancing. And this is a way of showing he's interested and helping to sort of establish that bond. Um, if anyone here has ever seen this out in the wild, it is a really neat behavior to see. And those sort of, wing flapping, dancing, the male wandering around the female, that is, that's pretty consistent throughout a lot of different birds in different families. Another species which has a really cool courtship display is the American woodcock. And for me, this is one of my favorite parts of spring in this part of the world, is going out at dusk, particularly, places around wetlands. Um, and with sort of open areas and seeing this courtship behavior happen. The male woodcocks, they're incredibly well camouflaged. They look just like a little football that's, looks just like the ground, looks just like the dirt or a pile of leaves. You can see in that photo on the right how well they blend in. So they're often quite hard to spot, but they'll sit there and they'll make this sound over and over again. And I'll show a video in a second that sounds like they're going, peep, 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 is their call. And then after doing that for a little while, they'll shoot up hundreds of feet in the air and they'll do this sort of corkscrew motion. That's really cool to watch. And much like the ruffed grouse, the passage of the air through their tail feathers produces this really interesting sort of like whirring sound, like so I'm going to show a video of this. There's places, I'm sure there's local conservation areas and parks around where most of you live where woodcocks put on these displays in the early spring. And I really recommend, trying to seek this out and watch this in person. It's one of the coolest, I think, things that you can watch happen in the wild in sort of southern and central Ontario. So we'll watch the woodcock courtship display. So the last bird where I'm going to share a video of it is from this species called the American bittern. So this is a member of the heron family. They're really secretive. They like to hang out in marshes, but they're incredibly well camouflaged. They are often stick their necks upright, so they look just like a bunch of reeds. They can move their head back and forth to sort of mirror, reeds or grasses moving in the breeze. Um, and they produce an incredibly strange call. The males, again in the spring and early summer, produce this really strange, grotesque sound. And I'll share a video showing it. And they do this by filling their esophagus with air and then contorting their neck muscles in a controlled way to quickly release that air through their bill in a controlled way. And it produces this really low resonant sound that almost sounds like dripping water. So I will share that with you. All right, so that is the sound made by an American bittern. Incredibly distinctive. You can sort of hear it at dusk and at night a lot of the time in wetlands around here, although they are a species which isn't as widespread as they used to be because of development and because of the loss of some of these habitats. But if you ever have the chance to go out to a marsh, particularly as you move, a little bit north of Toronto, it's a really cool thing to listen for, and sort of an unforgettable experience when you hear one of these call. To move into a little bit more detail, a lot of egrets and herons, members of that same family that the American bittern are in, the male develops these long nuptial feathers to attract mates, and they're called aigrettes. That actually comes from the same word in French that the word egret comes from. You can see on the right here, this is a picture of a great egret, which is a species that has, expanded northwards into Ontario a lot in the past 100 years, and we have them now, throughout the Oak Ridges Moraine and around the GTA. And if you've ever seen them in the early spring, they have these really, really cool long feathers like that, really long and wispy. They look almost like bridal tails or something like that. And in the 19th and early 20th century, these feathers were used to decorate women's hats en masse. They were the hottest fashion trend of the turn of the century. But unfortunately, there was commercial level hunting for these feathers, and that nearly extirpated several species of heron and egret from the US in particular. There was, a really intense market, down in Florida and the southeastern United States. People would go out to rookeries, places where the herons and egrets were nesting in groups and just shoot hundreds of them in a day. And it was driving these species to extinction. So that was actually one of the major factors that led to the establishment of Audubon societies. A lot of the time it was upper class women who were committing to not buy hats that had bird feathers on them. And it was largely a social movement led by wealthy white women in the U.S., as well as eventually leading to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which banned hunting of these birds, and banned the possession of their feathers and the use of them in the fashion industry. The great blue heron is probably the most familiar member of that family we have here in the Oak Ridges Moraine. You can see a picture on the right there of them, two herons mid-courtship. So they have a complex courtship ritual with numerous steps. It starts with two herons approaching each other, lowering their heads. The male will gather sticks and nesting material, and he, flies back and forth, presenting them to his mate, sort of showing off, his suitability to, build a nest. And it then proceeds into sort of an elaborate dance similar to the sandhill crane, that seems fairly choreographed, where they lock their bills. Sometimes they rub their bills together. They can outstretch their necks and stick them upright. Sometimes they'll fly around in circles. So it's quite an elaborate courtship ritual. And like some of those other egrets and herons I mentioned on the last slide, they do nest in big groups called rookeries. So if you're ever driving by the side of the road and you see a marsh or a wetland where there's a lot of dead trees in it with a bunch of nests hanging in them, big cups of sticks in particular, there's a good chance that that is a great blue heron rookery. The chimney swift is a really cool bird. They're a species at risk. They're in decline. They evolved to nest in things like caves and dead hollow trees, but as their name suggests, with the arrival of European colonizers, and building buildings with chimneys, they really like to nest in chimneys. And they spend almost all of their life in flight. In fact, they sleep and mate while flying. It's pretty spectacular to me to imagine an animal that can fly while it's asleep. But they're right here in downtown Toronto and all of our cities, flying around. And they're unable to perch, which is really interesting. The structure of their claws and their hands, their fingers, they can't actually perch onto a branch. They need to cling onto the side of something like a chimney or a wall or a cave. The way that the muscles and the bones are structured, they're incapable of perching. So they're a really interesting, example of sort of specialized evolution. These are two other favorites. We recently had an owl prowl at the Beaton Heritage Forest. We did not hear any owls for the second year in a row. So if anyone was on that walk with me, I apologize. Again, that's what happens when you have outdoor events, and none of these animals are on exact schedules or, want to perform for us necessarily. But the great horned owl and the eastern screech owl are two of the earliest nesting birds in the calendar year in this part of the world. They court each other in the winter, you know, from November to January. Oftentimes, you know, if you're in a woodlot at night or at dusk in that this part of the world at that time of year, you can hear them calling. The great horned owl has that classic sort of horror movie whoo, the whoo, 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 and you can sometimes hear them duetting. The male and the female do, you know, different numbers of the hoots and phrases, and you can hear them calling back to one another. I've heard this in parks around Toronto before. It's really cool if you ever have that experience. The screech owl sounds a little bit more like a horse whinnying. It's like a incredibly distinctive and strange noise that, you know, is liable to sort of catch you off guard if you're ever out in the woods and you hear it at night. They nest really early. They lay their eggs in February or March. And there's a lot of speculation about why this might be, why they may have evolved this strategy. It might present an advantage for their young. Their young may be already fledged and flying and able to hunt and care for themselves, while other birds, particularly the birds that they prey on, their young are still, you know, poor flyers and, you know, just sort of leaving the nest. So it might give them an advantage there. Although I think, you know, our understanding of it is pretty speculative. It might, you know, maybe, you know, learning to hunt and being able to fly earlier than other birds of prey, other owls, you know, may also give them an advantage as well. Um, Another species that nests really early in this part of the world is the pigeon, the rock pigeon, you know, that we have in downtown, in cities. They're originally native to, you know, the cliffs of Europe in places like Italy, but they've been introduced all over the world, and they breed all throughout the year and can nest in the middle of winter. This is a really cool one. This isn't really courtship so much, but like I mentioned earlier, talk a little bit about parenting and reproduction. So they have a really interesting evolutionary history, the brown-headed cowbird. They evolved, you know, several tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years ago, alongside large mammals, things like bison, woolly mammoths, mastodons, most of which are extinct today. And they have this sort of nomadic lifestyle where they followed these herds of large mammals and they would eat the insects that they kicked up, you know, by their hoofbeats. But it didn't really give them a stable place for them to nest and raise their young for an extended period of time. So they evolved to be nest parasites. So they will actually lay their eggs in the nests of other birds, like the cuckoos of Eurasia famously do. We have two species of cuckoos in this part of the world, but they only sometimes do they engage in nest parasitism. Most of the time, the black-billed and yellow-billed cuckoo, which are from this part of the world, will actually raise their own eggs. Um, yeah, it's interesting. For thousands of years, you know, after a lot of those large mammals like mammoths disappeared, the brown-headed cowbird sort of largely existed in Western Canada, Western US, following herds of bison. But as European colonizers came and, you know, hunted bison to near extinction, they introduced cattle for ranching. They modified habitats. You know, there was a lot of afforestation, you know, planting shelter belts and things like that across the prairies as they were converted to farms. The brown-headed cowbird was sort of able to um, skip its way over and expand its range into eastern North America, where a lot of birds didn't evolve alongside it, and so they weren't able to recognize cowbird eggs as, you know, belonging to cowbirds. So some songbirds are better at recognizing, you know, a cowbird egg in their nest than others. But a lot of the time, the birds are so dedicated to raising these eggs, you know, raising their young, that they aren't able to recognize it as, you know, anything other than their own baby. I've seen in High Park in Toronto a blue-gray gnatcatcher, which is one of the smallest birds in Canada. It's about, you know, just a little bit bigger than a hummingbird. And I've seen, you know, an adult blue-gray gnatcatcher feeding a brown-headed cowbird juvenile, which it thought was its own young. And that brown-headed cowbird was many times larger than it. You know, they're about the same size as a red-winged blackbird. But whether it's through, you know, the influence of hormones or what have you, or instinct, or however you want to, you know, frame it, they're so dedicated to caring for their young that they weren't able to recognize this giant bird that looks nothing like them as, you know, not being their own baby. So we'll talk a little bit about reptiles and amphibians. Here's a picture of some common garter snakes that are in, you know, wrapped up together. We'll talk a little bit about how they reproduce. It's really cool. So we'll start with turtles. Courtship in turtles tends to be aquatic, so it happens underneath the water. The painted turtle, which is the one on the top left, and the Blandings turtle, is in the middle there. They do something during courtship called titillation, which is a funny term, where they use their claws and they'll extend them towards their mate, and they'll sometimes stroke their face or stroke their neck. I've seen painted turtles sort of locked in courtship, where they're facing one another with their claws outstretched, going around in circles, almost like a dance. It's really cute if you ever get to see that happening in the water. Snapping turtle courtship is a lot less cute. It seems like a wrestling match to the death. There's a lot of hissing, snapping, rolling around in the water. It can be quite aggressive and violent. I've seen this as well in parks in Toronto. This happening before. And similar to the delayed pregnancy in mammals, they're capable of something called embryonic dispause, which is when they mate, but the eggs don't start to develop and become viable for a while. So they may mate in the fall, brumate in the winter, which is similar to hibernation, at the bottom of lakes and ponds, and then the eggs become viable in the spring and they'll lay their eggs. Common garter snakes. They tend to have a skewed sex ratio, so there's a lot more males. Sometimes it's, 10 or 12 to 1 ratio to the number of females. That's pretty extreme. And so, most animals, if there is a skewed sex ratio, it's not to that, extreme of an extent. So scientists aren't entirely sure why they've evolved this way. When they come out of hibernation, the females release sex pheromones, which attract mates, and they, go into these big mating balls where there'll be several males trying to mate with a single female. There's a place, about an hour and a half north of Winnipeg in Manitoba where there's just hundreds, if not thousands, of garter snakes out there, which come out in the early spring and engage in these big mating balls, and you can see them in these limestone kers, which are like caves in the ground, formed through erosion over the years. So you can watch just thousands and thousands of snakes in these giant mating balls. And interestingly, some male garter snakes will produce the quote unquote female sex pheromones when they come out of hibernation, and scientists aren't really sure why they do that. It might be a strategy to, get the body heat from other males, because snakes are cold-blooded, and that would help them, regulate their body temperature and have the energy to start the spring coming right out of hibernation. But they're really not sure why that happens. Ambystoma salamanders, incredibly cool. So we have three species here, the spotted, the Jefferson, and the blue spotted salamanders. They reproduce in vernal pools, which are in forests. These are temporary pools of water that exist very briefly in the spring. Um, their strategy is to have these mass mating events in these pools of water. They migrate, they're called mole salamanders for a reason. They spend most of the year underground, but in the early spring, they migrate en masse to these temporary pools of water, and they have these big mating events, and they lay their eggs there. And they've evolved this way because their eggs can develop really early in the spring, in April, in March, often when there's still snow on the ground. And their young can develop and hatch before these pools dry up and before a lot of predators are active. Interestingly, there's a group of salamanders called the unisexuals that are entirely female. And they exist around the Great Lakes and around New England. And they haven't reproduced sexually in 3 or 4 million years, which is incredibly unique. And scientists have no idea why they've evolved this, really unique mating strategy. They're entirely female. There's no male unisexual salamanders. And the two ways that they're able to reproduce are either to come across some of the sperm left behind after these mass mating events. And most of the time, that sperm just tells their body that it's time to reproduce and to give birth to young. It doesn't actually fertilize their eggs. Um, and so they'll lay eggs after coming in contact with the sperm. And the young will contain all the genetic material of the mother, but they're not exact clones of her either. They just express her genes slightly differently. Or they can actually incorporate the sperm and the genes from several different species at once. So they can actually have up to 4 different sets of chromosomes. So it's an incredibly confusing and strange way of reproducing, and scientists are not sure why they've evolved this. But it's happening right in our backyards. We'll talk a little bit about fish briefly. A really common species of fish that most people probably overlook is the bluegill. They're a type of sunfish. And a lot of this research actually comes from Lake Opeongo in Algonquin Provincial Park, studies going back to the 80s and 90s. So depending on how you approach it, there's either three different types of males or maybe four different genders of bluegill. And they have very different temperaments, different reproductive strategies, and they're very physiologically different. They have very different bodies. Um, so there's larger males, they're more aggressive, even towards their mates. So they guard the nests. They drive away anyone they can, perceive as a competitor, anyone they think is intruding on their territory. But they also will sometimes chase away their own mates, bite their own mates, butt into them. They're smaller males. They're much more numerous than the larger males, and they're less aggressive. And their strategy is after the, females have laid their eggs and the larger males have released their sperm to fertilize the eggs, the smaller males will sort of sneak in, try to avoid the larger males beating them up and chasing them away, release their sperm and try to pass on some of their genetic material, by fertilizing some of their eggs. What's really interesting is that there's a medium male, and they actually perform something almost like a courtship with the larger males, where they do a similar sort of sequence of courtship that the larger males would do with a female. And then they share territories with the larger males. I've heard scientists sort of jokingly refer to them as marriage brokers or relationship counselors. But there's some suggestion that perhaps the females are more receptive to larger males who have the medium males, sharing the territory with them. And that it helps, make them a little bit less aggressive, particularly towards their mates. And the larger males will actually allow the medium males to mate with their female mates as well. So it's a really convoluted, complicated system of reproduction, and it's sort of like a three fish couple, and it's incredibly unique the way that they've evolved this. Like I mentioned in the last slide, some of these species of fish actually do build nests. You might have seen a pond or a lake where there was a circular area, like a little crop circle on the bottom of the lake, where all the vegetation was, removed and there was pebbles there. A lot of different species of sunfish, like the pumpkin seed, will do that as well as the bluegill. And then species like the, largemouth bass do this as well. And the males will hang around those fertilized eggs and they will, chase away intruders and they'll be quite territorial. So to end the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about invertebrates. Fireflies, this is one of the, the most classic courtship displays in the entire animal kingdom. Bioluminescence is an incredibly cool phenomenon in which living organisms, animals, and sometimes fungi as well, are able to produce light with their bodies. We tend to think of it, happening in the deep sea with things like anglerfish and, deep sea squids and things like that. But fireflies are a cool example of this right in our backyard. We have about 23 different species in Ontario, and each one has its unique pattern of light flashes that the males do during courtship. And the females are able to recognize those patterns, so they mate with the correct species. In some parts of the southern US, there's actually species that do that coordinate their flashes of light. So it's all synchronized, and it's incredibly cool if you see some of the videos of that. But we don't have any of those species in Ontario. There's organic compounds in bioluminescent organisms called luciferins or luciferins, and they interact with these enzymes found in the bodies of bioluminescent organisms called luciferase. These are sort of like broad categories of, slightly, chemically different compounds and enzymes, as well as the presence of oxygen. And when those three things mix, it creates this, complicated chemical reaction which produces light. So that's one of the most iconic and cool, forms of animal courtship. Sexual cannibalism, always a favorite topic. We do have, throughout Ontario, the northern black widow. Not a lot of people realize this. They're extremely shy, incredibly wary of people. But if you look at iNaturalist, there's reports from around Toronto and places like that of people finding black widows in their yards. But contrary to popular belief, black widows don't always eat their mates. And it might actually be more likely that this happens in captivity than in the wild. The European mantis is a widely established, introduced species from Eurasia that we also associate with sexual cannibalism. And the female European mantises tend to eat their mates, roughly around 18 or 20% of the time. So again, it goes a little bit against the pop culture perception that, they always eat their mates. An example of a spider in this part of the world that sometimes does this is the six-spotted fishing spider. And eating their mates, it helps them have the energy to develop their eggs. And scientists have studied a number of species in which, the females engage in sexual cannibalism. And they've found that oftentimes eating, the male mate after mating allows them to produce, you know, larger egg cases. Their young are more likely to survive. It makes them more fertile. So there definitely seems to be an evolutionary advantage to eating your mate, having that food source right next to you when you're about to enter a very energy intensive period in your life of having young and giving birth. We'll end the presentation with a few sort of familiar summer sounds. This is the northern dog-day cicada. This is, something you hear all throughout sort of August in this part of the world. The really iconic call. Males can synchronize their calls, kind of like those, some species of fireflies can do in the southern U.S. And they create their calls in a really cool way. They have a structure on their exoskeletons called a timbal, and it's made up of something that almost is like a rib as well as a membrane. So if you imagine snapping a piece of flexible plastic really quickly, or like something like a zip tie, or like a sort of a sheet of like plexi plastic or something like that. That's sort of what they're doing. And when they flex their muscles, it causes those ribs to buckle, and that's what produces that loud clicking sound. Another way that animals, when they're trying to court mates, are able to produce sound is through something called stridulation. So that's when they make a sound by rubbing two body parts together. So these are two other, very common species that we have here, that we hear in the summer in this part of the world: the fall field cricket and the northern bush katydid. And they're able to produce the sounds that they make through stridulation. The male crickets and katydids will rub parts of their wings together, and that's what produces those sounds. I'm going to end with slugs and snails. Slugs and snails have two sets of sex organs at the same time. So they're capable of fertilizing eggs as well as having their eggs fertilized. And throughout their lifetime, they often sort of switch things up. And many species are capable of fertilizing themselves. They don't actually need to have a mate to produce viable young. Although some species studied around the world, it's shown that they produce less viable young, or their young is less healthy. So there seems to be an evolutionary advantage, along with bringing in new genetic material to reproducing sexually rather than asexually. They have a really interesting structure called the love dart, and they have this organ called the dart sac, which is located near their genital openings, where they keep these sort of long, sort of sharp, barbed structures made out of chitin, which is similar to keratin, which our hair and fingernails is made out of. And they're able to invert that dart sac, and it sort of quickly shoots out this love dart at a mate during, while they're courting one another. And it's covered in mucus, and that mucus transfers a hormone to the mate, which basically improves the chance of paternity of that whichever snail, first was launching the love darts, being the one who fertilizes the eggs when they mate with one another. Again, an incredibly strange and cool reproductive strategy. It's a lot less energy intensive to be the one who fertilizes the eggs versus, being the one whose eggs are fertilized and has to, like lay the eggs and, carry them to maturity and everything like that. So when they're mating, snails and slugs who have this, evolutionary system really want to be the one who fertilizes rather than the one who's fertilized. And I saw a comparison today when I was doing research about this. It is impaling them when these love darts go into their bodies and, transfer these hormones. And, adjusted for body size, it would be sort of the equivalent of a 15-inch, kitchen knife being like shoved into you by a mate. So it's a very violent and intense sort of courtship thing that they go through. So that is the end of the presentation today. I'm going to open it up to the chat if anybody has any questions about animal courtship, or wants to hear a little bit more about any of the species that I featured in the presentation today. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. This picture on the right here, you can see these two great blue herons. One of them is bringing a stick over. You know that, like I mentioned earlier, they like to sort of share the nesting material during courtship. So I will go back to Zoom here. And if anybody has any questions they'd like to raise, please throw them in the chat. All right. Yeah. Thank you, Joanne, for being on the call this evening. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope this was a fun presentation. I know it's a little bit of an unusual topic, but I thought it would be a fun thing to do for Valentine's Day. Yeah, it is an incredibly cute behavior, Emily, with the turtles. It's really neat if you ever have the chance to watch that happening in the wild. I've seen it with painted turtles out by Peterborough before, them sort of circling one another and sticking their claws out. It's really neat. Where have I seen a woodcock? I've seen them in Toronto, at Tommy Thompson Park, down sort of at the base of the park, right by the parking lot there. There has been some development there because they put in like a new visitor center recently, and new bathrooms and everything like that. But they like those sort of adjacent to marshes and wetlands and wet forests, those sort of like open areas where the males can display and be out there. It's good to sort of go out around dusk in April. I've also, I've been out in around Peterborough at a place called Cavan Swamp, and there's a road there that's, well known for this. The Peterborough Field Naturalist has done lots of walks that are sort of oriented around woodcocks and their courtship. And you can just sort of sit in your car or stand there and watch them, fly up in the sky and do their little corkscrew and everything. At the same time, the Wilson snipe, they also do an interesting courtship thing where they pass the air through their tail feathers to produce a sort of a whirring sound to attract mates. And it's also the same time when things like wood frogs and spring peepers are calling. So if you just look at eBird to see where people are reporting woodcocks and things like that, and there's a good chance that you'll be able to track some down and be able to see this in the wild. All right. Well, if I don't have any more questions, I might wrap it up for the evening, right at 8 o'clock. I hope everybody has a nice Valentine's Day, and hope to see you all at the next webinar and at the upcoming events. Have a nice night.